Okay, everyone, welcome to the session 2. We are going to talk about great powers and great responsibilities. Is cooperation and coexistence possible amid heightening competition? The world faces new and different challenges today. More conflict, even war, climate change, energy, and food crisis. After the COVID-19, we really need a global partnership. We need a global leadership, especially from the big powers, more than ever, to lead and overcome these challenges. However, we don't have that luxury. Indeed, we are witnessing the big powers competition increasing across the world, including in
Recording
South
in
China
progress.
Sea. So to understand this issue and what we can do to help everyone, because I think it is in the interest of all countries, especially those in this region, to maintain peace and security and to work together instead of competing one another. So today we have 4 distinguished speakers with us. The first one will be Professor Fyodor Lukyanov. He is a research director of the Foundation for Development and Support of the FIDI Discussion Club. He will speak online. And our second speaker will be Mr. Gregory B. Pauling from Center for Strategic and International Studies, the US. Our third speaker will be Senior Colonel retired Pao Bo, Center for International Security and Strategy, Tsinghua University, China. And the fourth speaker will be Dr. Sarah Kirchberger. She is the Director of Institute for Security Policy, Kiel University, Germany. For the interest of time, I would like to invite our first speaker from Russia Online. He will speak about the coexistence first, geopolitical balance needed for economic interactions. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Thank the whole audience. That's an enormous pleasure and privilege to me to speak for this distinguished conference. I'm very sorry that I could not make it to Vietnam this time, but I hope that the contemporary communication will allow me to deliver a couple of thoughts which are really very important in this turbulent moment. To answer the question which is put on the agenda, whether the coexistence and cooperation in the era of new great power competition is possible, the answer is definitely yes. But before we arrive to this balanced and more trustful situation, of course, we need to reassess a lot of things which we took for granted at the previous period in international relations. So if you allow me, I would briefly describe how we here in the Valdai Club, and I must say that I represent myself and probably my colleagues, not the official position of Russian Federation, how we see the contemporary moment and what are the biggest challenges in terms of great power relationship. The world is going through the most significant changes in the international system probably since the 20th century, and not even the late 20th century, but maybe even earlier. This change, which we are witnessing and which we are living through, is more decisive than the change we witnessed in late 80s, early 90s last century. At that time, of course, it was a very fundamental shift of the balance of powers, which was caused by collapse of the Soviet Union and the respective political and military bloc. But I think it's important to note that at that time, despite this big change and despite this collapse, structurally, no big changes occurred in the international system. The international system based on institutions as they emerged, as they were created after the Second World War, basically survived. And it was an expectation on all sides, actually, especially powers at that time. It was clear that the United States and the West played the most significant role. It was the expectation that the infrastructure created before could not only survive, but also be adapted to the new international order and successfully serve the purposes of this globalization, which started approximately at the same time in economic and societal globalization. It didn't work for several reasons. Probably it was an illusion to believe that such a significant shift of powers in the international system could spare the existing institutions from dysfunctionality and changes. On the one hand, we heard all this period since late 1980s, early 1990s, the narrative about rules which did satisfy all, but those rules were, of course, formulated by those who did prevail in the Cold War, and that was, in a way, quite natural. But at the same time, each next period, we witnessed that the domination by the Western understanding of rules in world affairs did not satisfy all important participants. And it launched the process of deformation of the previous design. This process started quite early, but it became pretty visible in early 21st century with several signs of this balance in international relations, starting from a new wave of terrorism, and then you name it, with the more and more tensions between big powers. Now we have a new situation, which is being marked by another significant power shift, now caused by just differences, by changes in potentials and capacities of big countries, many big countries. But this time, this power shift is accompanied by the decline of the whole institutional framework as it was, as we have it from the previous period, from the actually second half of 20th century. For many years, countries like Russia, also China, India, and many other claimed that the multipolarity was coming, and now we can state that the multipolar world is in place. But multipolarity, as we see it, means actually something else than many commentators envisaged 10 or 20 years ago. Multipolarity, as it started to be discussed in late 20th century, has always been seen as a concept to actually contain hegemony, to contain the domination of a particular country or particular group of countries. And that was probably natural that we tried to imagine this new multipolarity as a resemblance of something like multipolarity we knew from the European politics in 19th century, with limited group of big powers interacting with each other and defining actually rules of behavior for themselves and for all others. But current multipolarity is different. The nature of power in international relations is also different than decades ago. And we see that the traditional view, the classical view, that this power, this force, is primarily defined by military capacity. Now it's being challenged. It does not mean that military capacity does matter anymore. Unfortunately, just the opposite. We see what is happening in different parts of the world. But the combined power is defined by so many aspects, and all countries, all big powers, they have those aspects in different proportion. And sometimes we see that even middle-sized or even small countries, they can have just one aspect of power, but this might be absolutely decisive in particular situation. That the picture of Europe during the 19th century, the post-Napoleonic War period, with this concept of nations, which can agree certain setup of rules and then follow this, it doesn't work because it's very much asymmetric situation. It seems that to achieve what has been put on the agenda in our session, to achieve first coexistence and then cooperation of big powers, first of all, we should say that the big powers cooperation is not enough. It should be cooperation among actually all important countries. And I repeat that some of countries which were not counted as important international players before, now they do. They play this very important role. It seems that the approach, which was based on the assumption that the global institutions and the global framework, the framework of the solutions elaborated and implemented by the whole world on the global scale, this is over. It doesn't work anymore. Even in the area of climate, between the classical great powers, the countries which we considered as great powers before, need to be readjusted completely. And unfortunately, we can discuss it later why we came there. But unfortunately, it's not possible anymore to refer to the rules as formulated in the second half of 20th century or beginning of this century, because any international rules can be efficient only as long as the power arrangement and the balance of powers remains in a way as it was at the moment when those rules were formulated. When it starts to change, and now we see this process being extremely active, then we need to re-establish those rules by new wave of very significant consultations between all important parties involved. Thank you very much.
big powers, power shift, also the shift of the role of military capacity to other aspect, and even you mentioned about the big power cooperation will not be enough for today's situation. We need more countries, even regional organization, to play a bigger role. And I think this is exactly what happened in this region. ASEAN want to say a louder voice. They said, please consider ASEAN centrality. When big powers coming to this region, please talk with ASEAN countries. And for the next speaker, I would like to invite Mr. Gregory Bepoling. He will talk about U.S. interests and involvement in the South China Sea. You have the floor.
Red light's supposed to be on. There we go. All right. And thank you to the organizers and the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam for having me back again. It's always an honor. My first attendance at this conference was in 2014, which took place in Da Nang in parallel with the Haiyang Trio 981 standoff around the paracels. And while I'm not sure I can say that we've made a terrible amount of progress in the intervening 9 years, as Carl said earlier, perhaps the journey is half of the point. What I'm going to focus on are two main points. One, the diplomatic record of U.S. interests and policies in the South China Sea, and two, what I think are the two key potential points of escalation today where those interests and the interests of China rub against each other. Now, it is often said, as we heard from Dr. Wu earlier, that the U.S. position on the South China Sea has somehow shifted over the last decade or so away from the traditional U.S. position of neutrality, and I would push back against that. I would consider this, and I think many others probably would, one of the definitive statements of U.S. policy on the South China Sea. This was part of the intervention made by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at the 2010 ASEAN Regional Forum in Hanoi, when, in the wake of the war of the Notes Verbal and increasing tensions between Chinese law enforcement and regional states, the other members of ASEAN, including the chair of Vietnam, pushed the United States to make an explicit intervention for the first time at the ARF on the issue. And Secretary Clinton, in short, made what had been the longstanding U.S. position. One, the United States remains neutral on issues of territorial sovereignty. That said, the United States does have two direct interests in the South China Sea. First, the United States calls for peaceful resolution. The United States, like all of the external interested parties, believes that since at least the establishment of the United Nations, the international community has deemed the use of military force or coercion to be an illegitimate and illegal means to resolve territorial disputes. China's occupation of Mischief Reef the previous December. And if we roll the tape forward, we see the exact same U.S. interest encapsulated in the July 2020 white paper on U.S. positions on South China Sea claims, which Dr. Wu referenced earlier from the State Department. Now, where do those interests get us into potential escalation today? 2 points. One, the potential violence between China and the Philippines, which is in the news now on a monthly basis. Two, direct potential violence between US and Chinese assets when it comes to freedom of navigation and particularly freedom of overflight, not only in the South China Sea, but also over the East China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. In the case of Second Thomas Shoal, and this is not the only arena of Philippine-China tensions by any means, but it is the one that I'm going to focus on given the frequent reports. As I was getting on the plane to fly here from Washington, we were less than 24 hours after the videos of the most recent collisions around Second Thomas had been released. In one case, a China Coast Guard vessel collided with a Philippine civilian resupply vessel that was trying to evade that Chinese vessel's attempt to block its path to resupply the troops at the Sierra Madre at Second Thomas. In the other, a Chinese maritime militia vessel, the state-owned Chongsan U-3, collided with a Philippine Coast Guard vessel that was sitting motionless as part of the escort. In a sense, it's a little surprising it took this long to have collisions, because what we have seen for now almost 2 years is a monthly pattern of unsafe behavior around Second Thomas, beginning in the latter months of the Duterte administration. Every Philippine resupply mission towards Second Thomas was blocked and harassed by a combination of Chinese Coast Guard and militia vessels. You can see one example from last spring here using the AIS signatures of the ships. Here's another example from the summer. There was a brief pause after the inauguration of President Marcos on June 30th of 2022. China gave the Philippines a few months of breathing space, but by that November, the regular attempts to block resupply had resumed when it became clear that Marcos was not going to back down on this or any other issue related to the South China Sea. At the beginning of this year, we had the well-publicized incident in which a Chinese Coast Guard vessel used a military laser, or as the Americans might call it, a dazzler, to temporarily blind the crew of a Philippine Coast Guard vessel. We had multiple near collisions over the spring and the summer, including this incident this past summer, in which a Philippine Coast Guard vessel had to make an emergency all stop and reverse to avoid hitting a China Coast Guard vessel that cut across its bow, coming within a few meters of each other. We also had an incident even more recently in which the Philippines accused a Chinese vessel of coming within 1 meter of a collision. So again, it's a little surprising it took until October to finally have violence. We had, of course, the August incident involving the water cannon, which we heard referenced earlier. In response to all of this, President Marcos made an intervention at the ASEAN Forum last month, which I think encapsulates one of the fundamental differences between US and Chinese policy on the South China Sea, and which helps contribute to the downward spiral in China-Philippine relations. And that is the fact that in Beijing's official terminology, the South China Sea is increasingly a bilateral dispute between China and the US. The Philippines and other Southeast Asian states have no agency. They have no place in the dispute. They are merely puppets of some kind of shadowy conspiracy involving the US and sometimes Japan, depending on the speech. And understandably, this irritates the Philippines. When you are being punched in the face by a bully, the last thing you want to hear the bully say is, "Why are you listening to that other guy over there?" Now, this is the intervention that President Marcos made. 2 days later, as if to prove the point, we had yet another near collision. There are no US vessels in that image. The US does not conduct resupply missions to the Sierra Madre. There is a US P-8 patrol craft overhead, watching, standing behind the Philippines, as is the US position for all of its allies. In the wake of yet another near collision earlier this month, this was the editorial cartoon from the Global Times. The Philippines is nothing more than a stick that the Americans use to stir up trouble in the South China Sea. As long as this is the official Chinese position, it's hard to see how one de-escalates around Second Thomas Shoal, because the position of the United States is that it has no room here. The US is not going to negotiate on behalf of other states. It is not Washington's place. Beijing's position is there is no point in negotiating with anybody except for Washington. And the Philippines is nothing more than an agent of US influence. What is the US doing about all of this? Well, for the last 2 years, we've seen I would say once in a generation, period of modernization in the US-Philippine alliance, driven in large part by Philippine concern about the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea. The most visible example of this, of course, is the expansion and implementation of the 2014 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which involves US-funded upgrades to Philippine military bases, US preposition of equipment, and US rotational deployments for joint exercises and to enhance interoperability. One of the most visible, I think, forthcoming aspects of this would be the airstrip that you see on the left. That is the new airbase being built on Balabac Island at the southern tip of Palawan, which will help contribute to Philippine access and patrol over the Spratly Islands. In addition, we've seen the US and Philippines establish a new set of mutual defense guidelines, the first in the now 75 plus year history of our alliance. a new maritime security dialogue, a doubling of U.S. military support to the modernization of the armed forces of the Philippines, and so on. The U.S. position is that it is morally and legally obligated to the defense of its ally, and it will do whatever the Philippines requests in the South China Sea, including continuing to provide overflight during Philippine resupply missions, but it will not go beyond what its ally asks. The second point at which we may well see U.S.-China escalation, other than the Article 4 and 5 implications of the standoff around Second Thomas, is in the worrying increase in unsafe intercepts, particularly in the air. This is not only a U.S. problem. This is a problem for all users of the South and East China Seas, as well as the international airspace of the Taiwan Strait. I'm sure many recall last year we had the incident in which a Australian P-8 conducting overflight over international waters of the South China Sea was approached by a Chinese jet which intentionally released chaff into the engine of the plane. We've had multiple incidents in which the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command has released photo or video of PLA aircraft operating dangerously close to U.S. aircraft. We've also had multiple instances of the same involving the Canadians. Just last week, we had an incident in which Canada filed a complaint because a Chinese fighter jet approached dangerously close to a Canadian patrol aircraft conducting sanctions monitoring of North Korean sanctions violations under a UN mandate over the East China Sea. China argues that that Canadian jet strayed into the territorial airspace around the Senkakus or Diaoyu Islands. Canada says no. It's somewhat irrelevant because it's just one of nearly 300 such incidents over just the last 2 years. This summer, for instance, at the Shangri-La Dialogue, everybody focused on the dueling speeches by Secretary Austin and Secretary Li Shangfu, sorry, Minister Li Shangfu, in which Secretary Austin flagged this point over and over and called for the same kind of confidence building mechanisms and crisis management mechanisms that we heard Dr. Wu call for earlier and was largely rebuffed. What was less reported was the panel during which Canadian Minister Anand made the exact same point, and then when questioned by a PLA officer in the audience, got visibly angry and argued that the reason Canada is concerned about Chinese behavior is because Chinese behavior threatens the lives of Canadian airmen. At the annual CSIS South China Sea Conference last summer, Assistant Defense Secretary Eli Ratner argued that the increase in unsafe intercepts has been exponential and dated it to 2021. He promised to declassify information proving that point beyond just the occasional photos and videos we've seen. And last week, he went on record with those numbers, which have now been included in the recently released US Pentagon's annual report on the Chinese military. The argument from the Pentagon is that we have seen nearly 200 unsafe intercepts involving the US, 300 total involving the US and other allies and partners. That is one roughly every 2.5 days for 2 years. If it is a miracle that it took until this month to have a collision around Second Thomas Shoal, it is a larger miracle that we have not had a repeat of the 2001 EP3 incident yet. But if this continues, we will. There must be crisis management and communication mechanisms established before this escalates. And I will conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pauling. It is clear you explain about the U.S. stance in South China Sea. U.S. oppose the use of threat of force by any claimant. Instead, you suggested to use international law, such as UNCLOS. The U.S. want to maintain peace and stability, and also to maintain freedom of navigation. And as mentioned by Dr. Sun from DAV in previous session, today everybody can see clearly every incident, every development from the ground, from the camera, from the aircraft, from the drone. So we see clearly that multiple times dangerous situation occur in this region. And this is very dangerous. We need to prevent this from happening. We don't need more conflict in this region. So the next one, I would like to invite Senior Colonel Retired Chopo from Center for International Security and Strategy, Tsinghua University, China. He will speak about great power shoulders great responsibilities. I remember this is also a quote from one of the superhero from a movie. So I hope you can inspire us today, please.
Can you hear me? Okay, that's fine. Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador. And I thank you everyone for being present. And I want to thank Vietnamese government and Vietnam's Diplomatic Academy for inviting me to be here. Talking about a great power is responsibility. The first thing I want to say is nowadays, I find it's extremely difficult to be a Chinese. Why? Because China seems to be everywhere, even among things that has nothing to do with China. For example, the war in Ukraine has nothing to do with China. China is not informed, and China is not supporting Russia with anything in terms of material or military aid whatsoever. But still, people would ask, "Oh, where are you standing? Yeah, which side would you take?" So on and so forth. And our relationship with Europe is very much soured because of the war in Russia. And because there are so many European faces here, I wish to conclude about the future of China-Europe relationship in 3 sentences first, to just give you some tips. First, I believe so long as the war in Russia is going on, China's relationship with Europe cannot improve tremendously. Second sentence, so long as there is no war in Taiwan Strait, China's relationship with Europe will not become very bad. Third sentence, so long as China's relationship with the United States is not too bad, then Europeans will have a greater room to maneuver. That's it. Then talk about China's responsibilities elsewhere. I mean, elsewhere apart from South China Sea is easy because China is now global power, and China is, doing the right things to provide aid to Palestinians, to Ukrainians. But when it comes to South China Sea, things are more complicated in that China is one of the claimants. Yeah. So China is not only the major power, but China is also one of the claimants, and that makes things more complicated. But what I wish to say is, if we now compare Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, whatever you call it, with the rest of the world, you probably would congratulate yourself to be here because we are in a region that is relatively more peaceful compared with the war in Ukraine or in the Middle East. So on this question of South China Sea, I would say that China has exercises a lot of restraint. Just now, people talking about China use water cannon against the Filipino Coast Guard ships, as if this is a kind of use of violence. But I think that is actually is a kind of a minimum, demonstration of determination or will to safeguard Chinese sovereignty. What if I tell you that the Filipinos actually killed the Chinese in 2000 and 2013? Very few people mentioned that the Filipino Coast Guard killed the Chinese. And if you ask you this question, Chinese military is always stronger than the Filipino military ever since time immemorial. Then how can Filipino kill Chinese? Is it because that our policy toward the Philippines were problematic at that time? Is it because we're too soft on Filipinos and their Filipinos kill Chinese now? Then the question of external powers. I know my colleague Dr. Wu Shun mentioned how China wished that there is no intervention of external powers, but I think it's not possible. Yeah, so the external powers definitely would be involved. And here now I want to talk about, a few words about China-US dialogue. Right now, there is no dialogue between Chinese and American militaries. But my question is, so what, even if we have dialogue? because the dialogue is not going anywhere. Right? If we just resume the dialogue, that is not going anywhere. What is the use of the dialogue? And what is the reason that the dialogue is not going anywhere? That is because for decades, we have been discussing one term in Chinese, that is 安全, which could be interpreted either as safety or security. Americans would talk about the safety of the aircraft, the ships, and the crews and sailors, while China would talk about the security, of China's interest in this region. So we're just talking past each other, and this has been lasting for decades. So when it comes to this kind of confidence building measures, the United States is talking about tactical issues while China is talking about strategic issues. Then how about the possibility of establishing the so-called guardrails? I think it's not possible, or it's extremely difficult. Why? Because if you look at the history of the Cold War, you would find that the United States and the Soviet Union could talk just because the military strength, by and large, is on a parity. So they can afford to talk to each other. But in South China Sea or in the Western Pacific, Chinese military strength is quickly growing. But Americans just want to maintain the status quo. Then this is a difficult situation. Actually, we don't know which one could become stronger within the Western Pacific. China is not competing with the United States elsewhere in the world, but within, just within the Western Pacific, it's hard to say. If the Western situation of a war occurred, who could be stronger? So we don't know. And China just wants to become stronger. China wants to become a world-class military. So that kind of ambition would make this kind of a status quo extremely difficult to maintain. So therefore, I would say that the rules we have established in the past, like cues, like rule of behavior during maritime air encounters, would not really work because there are technical details. So the sense, of course, is for China and US aircraft or ships to keep safe distance. But what is safe distance? Because it cannot be measured because of different size of ships and aircraft and different speed of the ships and aircraft and the visibility and all these factors that are 7 involved in cues for identifying cues cannot be determined. So that's why we're talking about good seamanship, good airmanship in very ambiguous terms. Yeah, everybody is pointing finger at the other side, for failing to do that. But what makes China different is that I believe China is the only country that would respond militarily towards American provocations. Just now, Gregory Pauline mentioned, in every 2.5 days, Chinese would just do interception. My question is, why would China do interception? Because they happened near Chinese water and in Chinese space, in China's EEZ, right? So I have a pessimistic conclusion. Probably China and the United States could only cool down after another deadly collision at sea or in there. I don't look forward to that, but I just cannot find out any answer to this problem. I myself led a Chinese delegation to Pentagon in 2013 to discuss about this legal implications of the UNCLOS. We could not agree, except we agree, of course, okay, yes, we must have a freedom navigation and overflight. That's the only thing we agree. And we disagree on almost everything else. So this is my argument. South China Sea is far more dangerous than Taiwan Strait. This is my argument that I have promoted in international media. Why? I tell you. Because the Americans would keep on sending ships and aircraft to come. And for such a practice, they have practiced for decades. It's difficult for Americans to back down. And again, Chinese military is growing. And if we're becoming stronger, of course, we'll become less tolerant toward what we consider to be provocation. So the question is when, not if. We might have another serious accident And what happened after that, we can only imagine. Yeah. About the COC, I don't worry about it. Why? Just let me use a good example of ASEAN. ASEAN only have five countries in 1967 when it was established. And it was not until 1999, that means 32 years afterwards, that ASEAN become 10 countries. And the strategy or the success is make haste slowly. Because we need to discuss not only between China and the ASEAN countries, but also among ASEAN countries that people have pointed out. So this is the right solution. And finally, let me talk about what I think about UNCLOS. I always hear from Vietnamese people how we should safeguard UNCLOS, which is correct. But let me quote what Otto von Bismarck said. Law is a sausage. You'd better not to see how it is made. And the UN Convention Law of the Sea is the longest sausage in the world because it is negotiated for 9 years. So for people to reach a compromise, there are a lot of intentional ambiguities here and there. And that is why, to encourage people to ratify it, you can make declarations. China made declaration to Article 298, but China is not the only country. 35 countries made declarations. Do you believe China is the only country that care about security in the EEZ? So does Vietnam, so does Malaysia, so does India. India's clause is much more strict than China's because it asks foreign governments, it requires consent of Indian government if foreign countries wanted to exercise that involves ammunition and explosive in the exclusive economic zone. And we don't have a clause that are so strict. So when you're talking about safeguarding UNCLOS, be careful. Yeah, there are a lot of things that are really, really not so green, but gray over there. So illuminate the gray is totally fine. So that is what we should do. Yeah, to find out where really are the gray areas and try to make it a bit green. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Senior Colonel Chao Po. You mentioned about the China exercise a lot of restraint. No dialogue currently between China and US military. Even you mentioned that you are quite pessimistic about the prospect because you think healthy dialogue requires respect and you don't see that in the current situation. So we may see what happened on the track one between government to government. So that is why I think we should thank the DAV for this forum. We hope from this forum, we can find a breakthrough. Maybe we can see a progress about confidence building measures because we have more freedom to speak here, not just as the government official, but also as the expert. And then you also mentioned about the success story of ASEAN since its establishment in 1967 and how 10 ASEAN member countries can prevent any possible conflict among them and continue to look at the positive aspect of the cooperation. So I go to Dr. Sarah Kickberger. She will talk about the great power rivalry in South China Sea, the role of technical infrastructure. So maybe you can help us to change the tone from pessimist to optimist one. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for the kind introduction. I'm afraid I'm not much more positive or optimist than my previous speakers, but well, let's see. Many thanks to the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam and to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for hosting this excellent event. It's a great honor to be here again after last year, so thank you. Yeah, I wanted to take an outsider's perspective on the one hand, so I'm not here as part of a great power or a littoral claimant country, looking at the situation from the outside, from Europe, and also as a researcher, not a diplomat. And I find that the great power rivalry that we're looking at has a technical dimension and a dimension of technical development that is somehow often a little bit neglected compared with the other mighty issues of diplomacy and economic interests and so on. But these technical infrastructures that are being developed in the South China Sea, they play a key role for ultimately for a lot of things, for establishing connectivity, for protecting installations, including military installations, for maritime domain awareness in general, in all of its dimensions, and also for ultimately enhancing the claims that one or several sides make. So basically, they can even go a long way towards deterring outside intervention. And in that sense, these technical developments in the South China Sea, in my view, they deserve a little bit of a closer look in how they influence the overall dynamics of the situation. So how do I operate this? As someone talking about tech issues, I'm remarkably inept at operating technical equipment. Where do I have to press here? Which one? I pressed several. Oh, it worked. So which one? The green one. Okay. Okay. So in my view, looking at what happened in the South China Sea in this regard, 2012 was seemingly an important year. So in 2012, China, as you all know, established Sansha City. And the Global Times, the Chinese newspaper, commented at the time that they wanted to signal the determination to administer the Nansha Islands and related sea areas. And this new level of management carries more weight than the law of Vietnam, and that new measures would be necessary basically to enhance and solidify China's sovereignty over this entire area. So what kinds of measures are we talking about? So I don't expect you to be able to read this, but let me explain what this is. I try to make a timeline and look at the events from 2012 as they relate to technical developments and look at it from the perspectives of the great powers. So the part above is what China did on its side, and the part below the timeline is United States and other claimant countries in the South China Sea. And in 2012, basically in 2011, President Obama proclaimed the pivot to Asia, as you know. And in 2012, China occupied the Scarborough Shoal, wrestled control of Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines. So these were two, I think, key events. And then in early 2012, right after the Scarborough Shoal standoff, a leading small group on maritime rights protection was established in the Chinese Politburo. And then, of course, we have the establishment of Sansha City. So from that point in time, China started a huge drive of technical development of infrastructures to basically bolster these claims. And this coincided also with the buildup of a new spacecraft launch center on Hainan Island, Wenchang Spacecraft Launch Center. So during the same time when these islands were militarized, the Spratly and Paracel Islands, during the same time, in record time, a giant new spacecraft launch center on Hainan Island was also built up, making Hainan Island, from the Chinese point of view, a location of extreme importance because it has a ballistic missile submarine base at the southern tip. and China's most important spaceport, you could say, the Chinese Cape Canaveral, on its eastern coast. So Hainan Island became, by that, one of these extremely protection-worthy assets, you could say, from the Chinese point of view, making the Paracel Islands a natural line of defense, a defensive perimeter to protect these sensitive installations. And this is what we've basically been seeing, a steady push to enhancing the surveillance capabilities of the surrounding areas. And this led ultimately to the situation that we all have talked so much about on the, for instance, the Spratly Islands, but in a simultaneous fashion also visible in the Paracel Islands. In the Spratly Islands, we have these reefs that were basically littered now with various military facilities. We have talked a lot about among the scholars about hangars and runways and weapons for self-defense that were installed there. But even more interesting, I think, are the communication installations for satellite communication, fiber optic cables connecting all these features and also with the Chinese mainland, and radar dishes for surveillance, and perhaps also electronic warfare. And this is a pattern. So each of these big installations in the Spratly archipelago are very similar. So the equipment looks very similar when you look at it from above. So this is taken from a study by J. Michael Dahm, who has done extensive work on the technical infrastructures in this region. So this is your Fury Cross Reef, the major hub, you could say, in the Spratlys. And as you can see in Subi Reef, the list of the infrastructures that were installed there looks very, very similar. So it's basically a mirror of the capabilities of Mischief Reef. And then, of course, Fury Cross, I meant Fury Cross. And now Mischief Reef has almost the exact same set of capabilities installed. So this is a pattern. It is a very, very well thought through plan of turning these islands into assets in terms of a sensor chain, a sensor network, a hub for conducting all kinds of interesting surveillance activities, but most importantly for connecting all these Chinese claimed areas and to enable China ultimately to actually exercise control over these areas, because knowing what's going on in that area and who moves there and does what, knowing is like the precursor for being able to do anything about it, to react to stuff in a timely fashion. And we're talking a huge sea area here. So a lot what happens is never actually seen by anyone unless you conduct extensive surveillance. So another fantastic picture by J. Michael Dahm is showing basically the communication infrastructure that was built up in the Spratly archipelago. So he notices the redundancy of the communication infrastructure. So there's various different ways in which information can flow. It can flow through cables, redundant cables, but it can go via satellite communication, SATCOM, different types of SATCOM. And there's the new BeiDou system, the global navigation system that China built up that has a text message feature installed. So BeiDou can be used by ships for directly messaging each other, for instance. So this enables China to keep the contact with, for instance, the maritime militia boats that operate in that area, to be able to coordinate their actions. So this is something that really makes a difference in terms of how one can exercise presence and control in an area. And not every climate state can copy that approach for obvious reasons. It's quite costly. It's not something that a smaller country that's not economically so strong can afford. So we know from Chinese technical literature and from the brochures actually handed out by Chinese tech giants like CETC, what the plan is. The plan is to create this huge system of systems, of an ocean surveillance network that in the very ambitious plan actually envisages not just the South China Sea and East China Sea as its area of operation, but ultimately aims to expand along the entire maritime Silk Road to some degree at least. So this is a major issue, but as far as I know, the first demonstrator system was established and is already in place between Hainan Island and the Paracel Islands. So this is one of the key areas that China wishes to have control over. And this system is, I would say, an attempt by China to create deterrence by detection, making it basically impossible for anything to move either through the water column or on the sea surface or through the air by having basically the whole column from all sides under control. Then a more recent thing that deserves, I think, some scrutiny is the plan apparently by China to deploy floating nuclear power plants in the South China Sea. So up to 20, that is what actually official Chinese sources have said are being planned, and a couple already exist and undergo testing. Recently, there have been signs that there were hesitations, some hesitations that this may perhaps be a safety issue and some delay, but it's not clear exactly what's going to happen to this plan. And the question obviously arises, what does one need 20 floating power plants for in the South China Sea, which is not exactly a heavily inhabited area? And one potential explanation is, of course, some military systems can be very power hungry, some radar systems, but also energy weapons, of course, another type of system that's very power hungry. So this might be one of the reasons, but of course there are civilian applications, deep sea mining, there are other potential applications for this type of power. My time is almost up and I'm almost done, so let me finish. One American study mentioned a couple of points of concern that such floating nuclear power plants might pose for the region. In particular, that they would have safety concerns. They would generate some safety concerns due to potential accidents. They could help further militarization of the area. And so these are the key reasons why the rest of the region probably, my guess is, would not be so happy to see them there. But we will see. So finally, to bring the optimistic note into my conclusions that I was asked to include, of course, maritime domain awareness and information also has positive and cooperative potential. And I find that this information fusion center that Singapore has is hosting, and that is actually a site where a lot of countries, including China, including Russia, littoral states of the South China Sea, but also European states, where they cooperate and try and fuse information to solve common problems, common concerns, anti-piracy, for instance, trafficking, and so on. So maritime safety and maritime security concerns of common interest that do not touch so much on a great power rivalry, but that concern us all. So there are ways that this type of cooperation could probably be enhanced, where sources could be shared and pooled, and where the new types of technologies that are built up by different claimants could maybe be brought together to create, on the other side of the equation, a little more transparency. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kirberger. To end your presentation with something a bit positive. So you mentioned about, you're right, about technical dimension of the rivalry is not so positive. You mentioned about China building infrastructure in Spratly and Paracel Islands. And again, today, everyone can witness the development on the ground. And I think what we can do in this room, how we can use the perspective of international law to try to understand what happened from both sides. We hear the call for building trust, for more CBMs, healthy dialogue. I think everybody agree on that one. But how can we do that? So I open the floor for Q&A, and I would like to invite 3 questions first. Please, sir.
Thank you. Ewan Graham from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. My question in the first instance goes to Greg Pauling, but it's open to any of the other panelists who wish to respond. Greg, I'm glad that you flagged quote by President Marcos, so I don't have to do that. I think it was one of the most interesting interventions by Southeast Asian leader on any security context recent years, let alone on the South China Sea, on misleading narratives, as the president put it, around strategic competition, denying independence and agency to the Southeast Asian claimants. It was interesting in the context of who he was speaking to, which was the ASEAN leaders' retreat. I think that's an important point to flag, that he was pointing out that this narrative has taken hold in Southeast Asia. But I'd put it to you that it's not just a Southeast Asian or a Chinese fanned narrative. Strategic competition is also how the United States officially frames its security dynamic with China, perhaps in ways that actually unconsciously or unintentionally encourage this problem that you've talked about Southeast Asian countries taking a view of themselves that they are proxies in a conflict that really is about a tug of war for power rather than something more complex than that. And it occurs to me that it's not simply misleading in terms of the proxy point, but also it frames the things in terms of a 50-50 between China and the United States in power terms, rather than a more complex argument and contestation around norms and rules, as you put it, on law of the sea and other issues. So should the United States and others also rethink about how they actually use the terminology of strategic competition? Because I think it is having that undermining effect, not simply in Southeast Asia, but with some of the US's other allies in the region. I noticed this too, the Australian debate, perhaps elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Indian Ambassador, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. I think India was dragged into one of the presentations in terms of its position on the ratification declaration by India. I thought I will complete the whole story. What is also true is that India accepted an arbitration tribunal award and ceded thousands of kilometers of maritime EEZ to Bangladesh as a result of that outcome. So that was a recent phenomena. What is also true is that India has not expanded its EEZ to cover existing facilities which are used by other countries in its declaration or revision of declarations of its EEZ. So that completes the picture. The declaration largely relates to conduct of military exercises in India's EEZ. So that's the full story of India's adherence to UNCLOS. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is more on your explanation than questions, right? Okay. Yes, Ambassador, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. Proximity to the Indian Ocean also means that South Asia is facing both challenges and opportunity from the major power competition. ASEAN is doing their best in playing a role of centrality in the region. And they make it clear that they are not willing to take side in the context of major power rivalry. So my question is to Colonel Jubo and Dr. Sarah. What do you think that what the major powers, particularly United States and China, and their like-minded allies could do to make sure that they could manage the competition to avoid any risk of explosive confrontation and maintain a stable and cooperative environment in the Indo-Pacific region? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'll invite one more, please, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador. I do have a request for help from all the panelists, not just anyone, specifically. We have heard again and again the word laws and laws and laws. Overall, we have heard international law, including UNCLOS. But I have not heard any mention of, for example, in 2021, 2 years ago, when China passed two pieces of legislation. One is the law on Coast Guard, and the other is the law on maritime traffic safety. I believe myself as a good citizen of the world, wishing, hoping, and trying to observe laws. But I don't see the sense of commonality between two sides. One is international law in general and UNCLOS in particular. On the other side, the two pieces of legislation passed by China. So my request for advice is, can you help me, guide me in how to implement laws in this sense? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the three questions. Now I would like to invite Mr. Pauling to respond to the first question from SP, please.
Thank you very much. So, Ewan, it's a fair question. I certainly think that the contested public narratives around the limits of strategic competition, not just in the US, but in Europe and Australia and even in Japan, perhaps muddy the waters here. I would argue that the US administration has been quite disciplined and quite clear in its messaging around the limits, what strategic competition is. And it is fundamentally a competition over the rules-based order itself and whether or not Chinese revisionism can be or should be rolled back. And whether you look at the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, or the Indo-Pacific strategy, the core of that is the U.S. relationship with allies and partners, a U.S. recognition that we do in fact live in a multipolar world, and that the majority of that world prefers to maintain the current rules-based order rather than see it revised. That is also the core of U.S. interest in the South China Sea. Is that the way that the press in the U.S. or abroad reports it? Of course not. The press generally takes the most simplistic interpretation of every event the world over and paints it as a bilateral US-China problem. And that's because I guess that's the easiest story to write, and that's what people are that's what the wire's gonna run with. So I don't know if this is a very fulfilling answer, but I think the best that the US and other allies and partners can do is continue to keep disciplined official messaging and hope that eventually the press and the broader, think tankery catch on that not everything that happens in the world is somehow a bilateral US-China issue. If I may also just touch briefly on the difference in interpretation of laws. I mean, I think this is at the heart of the competition, which I don't like the framing of US-China competition, because it's not a US-China competition. It's a China and a pretty broad coalition of like-minded states competition. And at the heart of that competition is the nature of the rules-based order and international law, and whether or not laws, norms, and institutions have inherent value and power. And I think what we see in China's approach to UNCLOS, as with so much else, is a belief that is longstanding and quite public, particularly in Chinese legal circles, that law does not have inherent value. Law is simply a reflection of power. The current system in that view is simply a reflection of US power, and now it's time to change it. For anybody like me who's ever lived or worked in China or signed a contract for China, this is not an unfamiliar concept. Contracts only have value in as much as those in power decide they have value. The law is to be amended or thrown aside as necessary. That is not the US, or I would suspect the vast majority of the rest of the world's interpretation of how law works. And I don't have an easy solution here, but we are in for a decades-long bumpy ride of trying to socialize the idea in China that laws do in fact have inherent value and cannot simply be thrown aside as China's power changes.
Thank you. Yeah, on the question, what could the major powers do? The problem that we have is trust is created in international relations, at least. I think even in interpersonal relations, it's created over experience of repeated interactions with another party, and that other party acting in a reliable and consistent way. And that's how you create trust if there has not been trust from the beginning. Problem with behavior that could be classified as rogue behavior is that it disrupts this process of building up trust. If you negotiate with a party and then that party says it will do certain things, and then it will just turn around and do something completely different or exactly the opposite of what it promised it would do. And let me give an example. There was this famous moment when the Chinese president Xi Jinping in America said publicly that China would not militarize the South China Sea Islands. And then within the time span of, I don't know how much time it was, but it wasn't much, the exact opposite was done. And this is not how you obviously create trust. Now, so this is one thing. The major powers, they act not only on behalf of themselves, they also set the tone and give example to smaller powers that are observing their behavior. So in Germany, we say the fish begins to stink from the top. So if a rotting fish begins to smell from the top. So if the great powers give a bad example of behavior, of rogue behavior, for instance, and this has an effect, trickles down the entire system and erodes the potential for trust and also for cooperation. So this is my outsider's perspective on what could major powers do. Be conscious of their role, of their function, and try and behave at least consistently and not say one thing and do another. And the role of laws, well, I'm not a lawyer. I'm only a lawyer's daughter. It's not the same thing, I know. But laws do not exist in a vacuum. Laws came into existence usually because of a problem that occurred, and then a law was made because one recognized this problem needs to be regulated somehow. So the most important laws that the world has overwhelmingly accepted, like human rights and the United Nations basic foundational rights that are recognized, they came into existence after World War II when civilization had basically broken down and atrocities had been committed on such a large scale that the world recognized it needed to be governed by a different set of rules. And it's very easy to see how national laws that contradict, for instance, UNCLOS have conflict potential, but that does not mean that national law can take precedence. In Europe, we often have individual European countries making a law, and then the European Union finding that it contradicts something that the European Union as a whole has agreed to. And then this national law has to give way. That's the way it is. So of course, every individual country can codify something in law, but if it contradicts something higher that they voluntarily signed up for, like UNCLOS, then automatically follows that that national law cannot supersede UNCLOS, particularly not as it pertains to other states. I mean, this is basic logic, right? So otherwise, we don't have any sort of options of interacting in a meaningful way. If everyone goes, you could say, narcissistic and says, the world is only as I see it and nobody else has any say in that. That's not how we can create cooperation.
Thank you, Dr. Sarah. I would like to invite Senior Colonel Chopo to respond, but and after that, maybe Professor Lukianov, you also want to say something. If you want to respond to any of the questions, I'll give you the floor after Senior Colonel Chopo. Please, sir.
Well, a number of questions were asked, but the biggest question is about how the China-American competition would look like in the future. You see, China always stressed on cooperation, while United States would talk about competition. We're not talking on the same side of the things. But let me give you a very simple example. If we talk about, everybody would agree, we have to cooperate on climate change. This seems to be the only area of cooperation during Trump administration. During Trump administration, if you read anything, you would find, okay, climate change is the only area China and the US could cooperate, or would have to cooperate. Then my question is, why should we cooperate? The answer is very simple. We cooperate to survive. But if the answer, according to America, is we cooperate to survive so we can compete again, this is a sad world. You know, this kind of competition just to make people feel nervous. Well, cooperation, of course, make you feel pleasant. And if you listen to President Biden, if this kind of relationship is one of extreme competition, you feel more nervous. My question is, if the competition is already extreme, how far is it away from a conflict that nobody wants, right? Then the other question is about trust. Just now somebody mentioned trust. It is said by so many people, even by so many Chinese people, that we need a trust, yeah, to build better this relationship. My argument is no, not necessarily. Why? Because it's almost like a chicken and egg question, yeah? But the history of the Cold War tells us that even two enemies that have no trust at all could still, out of fear of mutually assured destruction, have a kind of a cooperation, right? The United States and the Soviet Union had a cooperation in outer space and in joint efforts in eradicating smallpoxes. And China and the United States are not enemies. So theoretically, we have more areas of cooperation. And things are moving this direction now. Seeing, you know, so many American, senior officials visiting China and a working group meeting being set up. What has that proved? That proves China is right. Yeah, this is what I want to say. Regarding what the Indian ambassador said just now, I totally agree with you and thank you for your clarification. But what I want to point out is actually India and China have more in common regarding international maritime law than you would have agreement with the United States. Don't forget, in the year before last, the USS John Paul Jones, the ship, went into your exclusive economic zone and challenged your excessive maritime claims. The Fifth Fleet read a protest against you, and you read back a protest, right? So you're not really birds of the same feather. That is what I want to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Colonel. And I would like to invite Professor Lukianov. You want to say something?
Yeah, thank you very much. The question addressed to all panelists, including myself, was about this balance between national and international law. I think at this panel we have a rare case of agreement between all of us, because I think we understand, as my esteemed colleagues said, that international law is not like a tablets of Moses given from heaven and sacred for forever, because the international law is a function of balance of powers and a function of what national interests are and how those national interests are being understood and interpreted by most significant players. And as I mentioned in my initial intervention, the number of most significant players is growing. I very much agree with the statement by Dr. Kirchberger about the danger of narcissism. And I think that we now live in a very narcissistic world, but this is universal. It's not just about powers which Western countries call revisionist, like Russia and China. If we think about narcissism, that the most powerful players from the previous period, like United States and European Union, I think they are much more narcissistic, and that's why they believe that their interpretation of international law, or as it is called now, rules-based order, is the only one. But unfortunately or fortunately, it is not the case anymore. And one more thing, I guess that quite important element of trust and confidence to be established is not only agreements between states. The confidence should start with self-confidence. And if most important countries feel unsecure, unsafe, and they feel non-confident in themselves, then it can provoke very different reactions. So self-confidence is first, and confidence among players comes next.
Thank you, Professor. I think time is almost up, but is it okay if I open for one more round? All right, so I'll invite 3 more from the room, and we have 2 questions from online. I would like to, yes, sir, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I have one question for the Chinese presenter. In fact, I think that the US, looking on the South China Sea, follows the international law. And I think that stability and peace in the South China Sea is the most important to sustainably develop the South China Sea. So my question is, why China also also follow? Why don't China also follow the international law, including the customary international law, and cooperate with the US? Two countries follow the international law, so I believe that will bring stability and peace and help other countries to develop, sustainably develop the South China Sea. Thank you.
Thank you. Second one, Indian ambassador again.
Sorry for, I think, again intruding into something, but comparison of India China is something which is not fair at all. What I said is that 2014 arbitration tribunal of UNCLOS decides that the claim of India-Bangladesh Maritime Zone should be in such a manner, India responds by welcoming it, accepting it, and giving up its claim in the EEZ of Bangladesh. So therefore, to say that the two approaches are have more in common, etc., I think that's not really, worthwhile and all. I thought I must clarify this thing of drawing a parallel between the approaches of the two countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the explanation. Okay. One more. All right. Please, ma'am.
Thank you. I'd like to stress the importance of perceptions.
Can you mention your name and
Yes,
organization, please?
I'm Nin, president of Ho Chi Minh City Peace and Development Foundation. I'd like to stress the importance of perception. I remember once telling a Chinese academic that Vietnam, at least, as a Vietnamese, we don't object to China's rise. It's a reality. But in today's world, the perception about the way China rises matters. The US had the advantage when it rose that nobody had anything to say, really. But the world has changed. So people notice and have an opinion about the way a second superpower rises. So in the near environment of the South China Sea, China has to take into account the perceptions of the members of ASEAN. And although from the legal point of view, of course, it's got to be mostly settled bilaterally. But I don't think it serves the region nor China to discard the importance of the role and the voice of ASEAN as a grouping. And as was mentioned by the speaker from Russia, regional groupings have more importance and more say, I believe, today than they used to have. And in the case of the US, in terms of perception, remember that after all, nobody from this part of the world has been doing anything in the Monroe Doctrine region or hemisphere, for which the US, has a long time enjoying kind of supremacy. So in other words, I'm saying that to explain the sensitivity on the ASEAN and more particularly the Chinese side. So as a Vietnamese, I think we need to be objective. The US role and voice in this part of the world needs to be accommodated to the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, I want to read the online questions. There are two. What is the potentials of China's new initiative, GDI and GSI, for South China Sea cooperation? Question number two. Although the US recognized ASEAN centrality role, its recent approach has mainly included bilateral cooperation with close allies or partners and unilateral cooperation with countries outside the region. Any contradictions? So I would like each of our speakers to respond to the questions from the room and from the online platform. And then after that, we can close the session. I'll start with Mr. Pauling.
Let me begin with the online question. So yes, the US recognized ASEAN centrality in the same way that the ASEAN members themselves recognize ASEAN centrality, which is the US writes it into all the relevant statements, and it works through ASEAN on those issues on which ASEAN is actually working. But ASEAN does not take up the vast majority of issues relevant to the 21st century, at least not. ASEAN is a wonderful economic body for solving 20th century issues in a 21st century world. But whether it's the South China Sea or the Mekong or the wars in Ukraine or the Middle East or the crisis in the Taiwan Strait or AI or digital trade, data flows, supply chains, ASEAN is not central to the efforts of its own members on any of those issues. The US works with ASEAN where it can, but when Filipino and Vietnamese and even Indonesian often voices come through Washington, they are not asking the US to work more through ASEAN. They are asking the US to do more bilaterally and in other coalitions. So as soon as ASEAN begins working on those issues, the US will be more than happy to work through ASEAN mechanisms. I would also note that I have absolutely no idea what minilateralism means. ASEAN is a minilateral institution. So is the five-power defense arrangement. So is BIMSTEC and ECMEX and the MRC and the Lansing Mekong River Commission. As far as I can tell, minilateralism is just what we use when certain capitals in ASEAN feel uncomfortable with something. So it's minilateral if it makes you feel uncomfortable, and it's multilateral if it doesn't. But I have no idea as an academic what exactly we mean. If it's not the UN, it is by definition minilateral. The Quad and AUKUS have just as much right to exist as the dozens and dozens and dozens of other acronyms we could all come up with that operate in this very region that are not ASEAN centered. And the other point I would make on the Monroe Doctrine is it's a wonderful point, except that James Monroe was the president of the United States 215-ish years ago, and the world has moved on. The Americas are not organized under a unilateral US imposed Monroe Doctrine. They're organized, among other things, in the Organization of American States, in which all countries, big and small, have a voice. And any effort to establish Chinese hegemony in the Indo-Pacific today would be just as absurd as any effort by the US to reestablish a Monroe Doctrine in 2023.
Yes, please, sir.
Okay, on the question raised to me virtually, how China's GDI and Global Security Initiative and Global Development Initiative could be applied to South China Sea. I wish to say that these two initiatives are really, really interesting in that don't underestimate the Chinese very abstractive initiatives. Look at BRI when it was proposed in 2013. Even few Chinese understand how it might develop, but now it is around the world. And now there are many, many competing initiatives. The most recent one would include Europe, Middle East, and India. And I can tell you, it will fail very quickly for two reasons. Number one, these countries do not have money. Number two, this project will lose money. That's it. Because it is economic speaking, it would not make sense for you to upload something on train and then by ship and then go through ports. That doesn't make any sense, mathematically speaking. That's it. And then about the Global Development Initiative, there is under it BRI. Then on the Global Security Initiative, there is a PLA now doing all humanitarian operations around the world, mainly in peacekeeping, counter-piracy, and disaster relief. That is something I really want to stress. Apart from China's sovereignty issue with some other countries, PLA is just doing humanitarian aid overseas, elsewhere, because all the operations are humanitarian. Then when it comes to South China Sea, I would say because of all the entangled problems, certainly development would become easier than security cooperation for everything that we have mentioned in the morning. So that is why I hope actually COC could be negotiated satisfactory to all. I don't know how it would look like. I don't know whether it would have teeth or not, but because this is by natural, or multilateral agreement, so I hope it becomes satisfactory to all. Then we take it as a guideline and to do some concrete, cooperation. Remember one thing. In the Taiwan issue, China wants to resolve Taiwan issue peacefully. But still, we have three conditions that we have to apply when we have to resolve it with military means. But between China and the claimants of South China Sea, we have never talked about use of force or even threat of force. So this is where we should have confidence. Let's hope for the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sarah.
About the chances for success of these new initiatives, I think I agree certainly that the will and the financial firepower is one key factor in the success of such initiatives, without a doubt. So if it's only a paper tiger, it's not gonna have a big impact. When it comes to the South China Sea and China's chances of making these initiatives work in its favor, I think it's an uneven picture in the ASEAN countries. So some countries, for instance, Myanmar and Cambodia probably will be welcoming more investments and more projects. And other countries, due to the tensions, for instance, Philippines right now, and maybe Vietnam, others will be much more hesitant because of a trust deficit, I would argue. I would say, despite trust not being the only category here, it does make an impact. So if China were perceived very positively in the region across the board, then of course this would have a big favorable impact for these initiatives. But the actual situation is a little more complicated, and I anticipate that there will be some hesitation in a couple of countries regarding the Chinese initiatives. But we will see how it plays out in real life. It's always hard to predict.
Thank you. And the last speaker, Professor Luciano, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's quite interesting that the Monroe Doctrine has been mentioned here. I would remind all of you that exactly 1 month from now, it will be 200 years since President James Monroe declared a couple of things which later on were called the Monroe Doctrine. I very much agree with my American colleague. The concepts like Monroe Doctrine and many others from the past, they are not just wrong. It's not about wrong or right. They are not working anymore. It's absolutely inefficient to try to introduce when big powers or middle-sized powers, whoever, try to introduce influence sphere on others around, it will not work. It maybe some countries would like to do it. Sometimes people accuse my country for doing that, but I can assure you that even here we understand that it doesn't work anymore. Having said that, I must say that the respect for security and other interests of countries should be there. And that means that just to try to formulate some rules based on any ideas without taking into account how those rules will be perceived in particular countries, it has no future either. And as I mentioned in my initial introduction, I think the way forward is a regional cooperation based on flexible multilateralism, when those countries are included in addressing most important issues for which those issues are vital, not just those who want to do it. And I think this is the way how we can proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. So excellent. I think we have concluded this session. I hope this is useful for all of us here, also for our participants online. We can see that there are commitments, there are good initiatives from many countries, including the big powers. to try to maintain peace and security in South China Sea. But certainly it wasn't enough to address the current situation. I'm going to close this session by using your word, Senior Colonel Chow Pao. You mentioned about what is the incentive or motivation for cooperation, whether it is trust or fear. So I think most of us will agree with me that we choose trust over fear. So I would like to call to everyone that to really keep that in mind. So keep the optimism in the room. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, our distinguished speakers. And now it is time for lunch. So the lunch is readily served at a restaurant. Well, pardon my French, a la Croisière at level 2 of this particular hotel. So just follow the reception people out there. And also just to keep in mind for our on-site delegates, we are going to have a luncheon keynote with Mr. Martin Thummel, the Commissioner for East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific from the Federal Foreign Office at 1 p.m. at the lunch. And also we are going to have a live commentary regarding the first two sessions with Dr. Nguyễn Nam Dương from the East Sea Institute and other honorable guests here live on stage at 1:30 p.m. And the next session, session 3, is going to start at 2 p.m. sharp. Yeah, that is all of the housekeeping notes. Enjoy your lunch. And our online audience, I know that there's a lot of questions left, so feel free to drop any comment and feedback on our live feed on Facebook or emailed or on our social media. Thank you.